Hello, this is Mark Galeotti from the Institute of International Relations, Prague, with another little thought piece on protests in Moscow. Because there were more protests in Moscow and indeed elsewhere in Russia yesterday, and yet these were really rather different from the last batch. In some ways, they're actually almost embarrassingly small, often just a few hundred people, quite often indeed outnumbered by journalists and police. They led to a certain number of arrests, but not really much impact. But these are very different from the previous ones, not least because they had not been called by Alexei Navalny, the potential and would-be presidential candidate to run against Putin, but rather by exiled former oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky and his Open Russia organization. 3 points worth mentioning. First of all, one of the crucial errors this time round was to actually make the protests explicitly opposed to Putin, trying to get Putin not to stand for the 2018 presidential elections. Now, one of the reasons why Navalny was so successful is that he has identified Prime Minister Medvedev as sort of the weak link in the Kremlin's chain. Medvedev has very little credibility, is politically tone deaf, and has been demonstrated by Navalny and his very, very effective video campaign as being also deeply, deeply corrupt. So this was actually targeting Medvedev, not Putin. Now, implicitly, you attack Medvedev, you are also attacking the whole system. But it's a way of not crossing the red line and also not hitting upon the still kind of rather iconic status that Putin has as some kind of avatar of the Russian nation. And then at the same time, this was about corruption. Now, corruption is something that all Russians understand, that all Russians feel angry about, and is an issue that can unite people across the country and from the top, near the top, to the very bottom of the social strata. So it's actually a very, very powerful cohering force. Whereas these protests were just about Putin and about politics. And frankly, it's not just that people may not be as motivated by that, it's more to the point that they don't think that anything can be done about that. No one honestly thinks that if enough people hand in petitions, Putin will say, fair enough, I won't stand for president. That's rather pointless. So thing number one is, what was different about these was the target. Point number two is what was different about these is where it came from. Now, Navalny still is working on increasing his profile within Russia. An increasing number of Russians know about him. And of course, that means that a certain number of people regard him as an opportunist or a charlatan or a Western spy or whatever. But the point is they know about him. Khodorkovsky is in a rather different place because basically every Russian knows about him and actually despises him. For his role in the 1990s, he was one of the oligarchs who were responsible, frankly, for the plundering of Russia on an industrial scale. And although I'm perfectly willing to believe that, in fact, he has seen the error of his ways and that he regrets the way that he sort of bolstered an essentially criminalized regime and that now wants the best for Russia, but for most ordinary Russians, his brand is as toxic as they come. And therefore, so not only did we actually have probably a mistaken target, we also have the fact that the person who's really behind them is in many ways the archetype of the exploitative billionaire who is now from outside Russia trying to manipulate our politics. That's not going to play well either. That raises me to my third and last point. Why did they do this? Why did they hold on a relatively arbitrary date a series of protests, especially when Navalny has already called for nationwide protests on the 12th of June? That is this Russian holiday, Russia Day, that frankly no one really knows what that's about. And so it's a good chance to actually almost sort of create some kind of identity for the day. This has been one of the perennial problems of Russian opposition to Putin, division. The fact that people are not willing to submerge their own egos and many aspects of their own agendas and create some kind of common front. And this has been so useful for Putin. We saw this with the Bolotnaya protests in 2011-2012, in which, despite all the extraordinary initial enthusiasm and passion of the events, particularly in Moscow, it quite quickly fell apart amidst a whole series of recriminations, factionalism, and people just not being willing to do a lot of the grunt work, but wanting to be a leader instead. Now, Navalny, who seems to have learned many of the lessons of that and has definitely been sort of trying to find alternative ways of building a platform and building some kind of national constituency, and who is at the same time on the one hand, softening some of the nationalist elements of his campaign, which could have won him some degree of support, but certainly sort of alarmed those of us in the West who'd like to see a liberal Russia. But at the same time, has actually been developing connections with other sort of elements of the political scene, including particularly the Moscow City Communist Party. The Communist Party up to now has basically been willing to be a fake opposition party. But there are now some within the party who are actually thinking, well, maybe we should be doing something more about this. And here you have Khodorkovsky, who, and maybe I'm being tremendously unfair, but I can't help feeling this is almost a sort of a me too attempt to leap on the bandwagon, decided to have his own event, and probably in this race, if anything, acted as a spoiler. I hope this won't have an impact on the 12th June protests, but it might. Now, Khodorkovsky could not openly support Navalny and have that to be anything other than a vulnerability for Navalny. Again, it would play so perfectly for Putin's propaganda machine. Again, they would say, you see, we always told you that Navalny was nothing more than a stooge for exploitative and hostile outside forces. That's fine. But first of all, at the very least, Khodorkovsky cannot try and get in Navalny's way. Secondly, I mean, there are indirect ways of providing support and so forth, even if it's just in terms of being able to ensure that there are cameras at the right events and such like. But when it comes down to it, we do come to this fairly sort of basic and banal point. First, do no harm. At the very least, if Khodorkovsky really wants to see change in Russia and is really committed to a long-term democratic process, then at this stage he should not get in Navalny's way. And that is my concern about yesterday's protests. I suspect they're actually going to be irrelevances more than anything else. But that's in some ways the best case scenario. What I hope they don't do is actually create some kind of vulnerabilities for Navalny in the future. Because this is what's going to be interesting. We're going to have to keep our eyes on the 12th of June. If Navalny, especially now that he's beginning to come under serious fire from the Kremlin, we've had sort of video slander suggesting that he's some kind of Nazi and so forth, and is also increasingly actually facing some kind of personal threat, people sort of splashing rather toxic green dye on him and so forth. If he can keep up the momentum, even if he can just simply have a similar scale turnout on the 12th of June as he had before, then that will mean something really very serious and important. If he can be better, that's great. If, on the other hand, we start to see momentum running against him, then unfortunately it means that the regime can sit back and be more comfortable. Why is this important? Well, if the regime feels under pressure, firstly, it might make concessions, more likely it will make mistakes. So very much in the next couple of months, it'll be all to play for in Russia. Not because I think anything will change the results of 2018, Putin's going to stand, Putin is going to win, but in terms of the overall dynamic, that is going to be an interesting thing to see. Thank you very much.